Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Lila LaHood, publisher of the San Francisco Public Press. Thank you for joining us this evening on Zoom and on Facebook Live. You are here with us for Transparency in Lockdown, Journalists on Open Government During COVID-19. I'm going to hand things off in a minute, but just to let everyone know, we will be accepting questions in the chat. You should direct those to Liana Wilcox. Her name is labeled Questions Concerns. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, we also have Mel Baker, our producer and programming director, monitoring questions there. Laura, I'm going to hand it off to you. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening.
Great, thanks Lila. So we're talking today about open government during the coronavirus pandemic because back in late March, actually, the Society of Professional Journalists of Northern California and the First Amendment Coalition and a couple other freedom of information groups were actually already calling on state agencies to respect the California Public Records Act, and they were calling out state agencies for saying that they'd stop responding or respond more slowly to records requests until the crisis passes. Well, we're now 10 months into the crisis and it doesn't seem to be going away. And locally, Mayor London Breed early in 2020 had suspended certain elements of the Sunshine Ordinance and open records law in San Francisco, and journalists have found it fairly difficult to get answers to questions from various city departments during frequent virtual press conferences. I've been hearing a lot from local reporters about their experiences running into these roadblocks, and I've run into a couple of them myself. So I wanted to get some journalists together to paint a bigger picture of how this reduced access to information during a health emergency is affecting our work, and more importantly for readers and listeners, how it affects the news that reaches the public. So tonight we'll be hearing from a couple of journalists. Lydia Chávez is the executive editor at Mission Local, which has been tirelessly covering the pandemic and its disproportionate impacts on the city's Latinx residents. Lydia, welcome.
Thank you.
Trisha Thadani is a City Hall reporter with the San Francisco Chronicle, who's been covering nursing facilities, homelessness, mental health, drug overdose deaths, and drug policy, plus other topics as well. Trisha, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Scott Morris is an investigative journalist who for the last year has been working with the Bay City News Foundation and ProPublica. You can hear about one of his investigations on a recent episode of Civic and read more of his work there. Scott, hey, again, thanks for coming back.
Hey, it's nice to be here.
And we also have Nuala Bishari, an independent reporter who writes for the San Francisco Public Press in these times, and she also has a regular public health column in the San Francisco Examiner. Nuala, welcome.
Thank you.
So I want to encourage all of our panelists to jump in whenever you have something to add so that we can have a conversation about this. And I also want to hear from everybody else who's attending because this event is open to the public. We do default to having your video and audio off, but I'd love to take your questions. I think you've probably heard Lila mention you can chat those questions to Liana, whose video is off right now, but her name tag there on Zoom is questions and concerns. So if you have questions for any of our panelists, shoot them to her and she'll pass them on to me. And we do have quite a bit of time allotted to opening this conversation up to questions. But I want to start with something that's been, I think, difficult for a lot of San Francisco reporters and reporters from outlets based outside of the city who still cover it. And that's the press conference format that local officials have been using to answer questions. And what happens here is that reporters are asked to join the web conference and their video and audio is turned off, which given what I just said about how we're managing participation in this event because of Zoom bombing, I think I can empathize with that, a little bit. But reporters then have to submit their questions in a specific format, and it usually takes, they're usually supposed to do that before the last official finishes their remarks in order to actually get them answered. So I'm hoping that all of you can weigh in a little bit on how this has affected your ability to get your questions answered. And Lydia, I'm thinking maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, it's a terrible setup. I mean, they just decide it's some of these press conferences not to answer questions. And, the first, I would say 6 or 7 of these Zooms in which I'm, Colfax is taking questions, he never answers a question. I mean, he takes a question, but he totally dodges it. So we're not there. So there's no follow-up. And people just, you're constrained, you can't follow up. So I think it's both the nature of the person taking the questions and not so much the questions, and then the format, it just really puts journalists at an incredible disadvantage.
Yeah, Nuala, you've run into this problem as well, right?
I have, not so much during press conferences though, more through email. Do you want me to address that?
Yeah, I do want to get around to that. So maybe
Okay.
Trisha, what are your thoughts on the press conference in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I totally echo what Lydia said in that it's just, I mean, the best part of press conferences is that you were able to sort of yell questions and you were able to get politicians to answer them in like an off the cuff way if they weren't expecting it, right? And you can get more of an authentic response where, you know, one thing I notice is when you put it in the chat, maybe they have more time to like prepare, they have their spokespeople behind there that they can, you know, feed answers into and everything, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just a different way of getting answers. Another thing, yeah, like there was times when my questions, when I submitted them well before the deadline, when they just wouldn't get answered. There was one time I asked a question of one official, and I actually ended up getting a call from their spokesperson right after I'd submitted it, being like, "Oh, they're not going to answer it in this press conference. Like, let me get you a statement later." And I'm like, "That's not how this is supposed to work." But so yeah, it puts us at a serious disadvantage of just getting, you know, answers in a public forum from our officials.
Scott, I don't think the press conferences in San Francisco are really your wheelhouse, but maybe you can give us a sense of whether you've experienced this at other state or city press briefings during the era of virtual press conferences that we're in now.
I agree that the nature of my work, I don't really do a lot of press conferences or
Yeah.
attend a lot of press conferences, or I haven't been lately. One thing that you said that stuck out to me though, is if they're only taking questions that are submitted before everybody's finished speaking, a lot of times, like, you know, answers to questions will beget other questions, and that would be problematic to me. Is if I hear an answer for somebody else's question, that may give me a new question, and if I can't ask that would be frustrating.
Yeah, I think one of the issues around this that I've heard from a lot of reporters is, you know, you want to go to these press conferences to try and get your questions in front of the public officials who are best qualified to answer them. And it's difficult to get people to talk with you outside of those press conferences, which, you know, everybody's busy. But what have all of your experiences been trying to, you know, get interviews with relevant city, county, or state officials, or getting even into facilities, for example, at the city, county, or state level that are relevant during this crisis? Trisha, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah. So yeah, in terms of getting interviews, it's just harder. I mean, you constantly hear, oh, they're, you know, to get an interview with Colfax, I feel like is pretty impossible.
And we're talking here for anybody who's not well versed in this, we're talking about Grant Colfax, who's the director of the public health department.
Right. Easily probably one of the busiest people in the city and county right now, but still, like, he should have to answer to reporters. And I was trying to get interviews with him a lot in the beginning of the pandemic, and it just wasn't possible. And in terms of getting into facilities, I mean, we were trying to get into Laguna Honda in the beginning to see when they had an outbreak there, to see how things were going. We've also tried getting into like the hospitals to see the ICU units, so we could show these images to the public and, you know, describe what it was like in there. But we constantly got and are still today getting stonewalled of getting into places because people are saying, you know, because of COVID restrictions, you can't come in. So it's just harder to do our jobs in so many ways.
Yeah, Lydia, what's your experience been?
I mean,
to sort of corner people.
Totally agree. I ran into Colfax, I think this was in the summer sometime, at the hub, at the Latino task force. And I had been asking, you know, every week, I would need an interview. And so I, you know, grab him. I didn't grab him, but I get in front of him and I start asking him questions, and his assistant comes over and says, "You can't ask him questions." And I said, "You're fucking kidding me. I'm going to ask him questions. I've had a request for an interview in for 3 weeks, and we're doing this now." And so he stood there for about 10 or 15 minutes, managed not to really answer any of my questions directly. But then they did follow up a couple of weeks later with an interview, and I've had some access since then, but, you know, it's incredibly limited.
Nuala, I think this is maybe the time for you to jump in with your experiences trying to get interviews with people from various city departments.
Yeah, sure. So I think in regards to phone calls, I mean, that's always a really good way to be able to ask questions to people directly. I have been struggling quite a bit since the pandemic started, since nobody is working in their offices right now. And so a lot of the phone numbers that I have for people are their office lines. And I don't know how often those are getting checked. Often the voicemails are full, and it's incredibly difficult to get through to people via email, which I can talk about in a minute. And so at this point, I'm really depending on my colleagues to help me track down people's cell phone numbers. And even then, you know, sometimes people are not getting back to you. But the line of communication, a lot of the existing contacts that I have for people are now no longer valid.
Yeah. So what happens when you try and email somebody to get an interview with them?
Well, so for those who are unaware, in March, the city decided to start triaging media requests through the COVID Command Center, which is run by the Department of Emergency Management. And so right now, if you want to get a quote from the Department of Public Health and often even the Department of Homelessness, you have to email DEM directly. And I have just had a hell of a time trying to get information out of them. The answers I get often do not come from the departments that I'm trying to contact. Requests are very, very slow to actually land in my inbox. Sometimes it takes days and days, and they don't arrive until well past my deadline. And the questions I ask are very rarely answered. So I can give you an example or two if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sure. So in September, I covered an illegal private sweep of a homeless encampment outside a large event space in Soma. As the sweep was not conducted by the city or sanctioned by it, I thought it was vital to include the city's perspective on the issue. So I reached out to the Department of Homelessness via DEM for comment, and I asked 3 very clear questions with bullet points and spaces between them. 3 days later, far past my deadline, I received a response that answered one question, credited only to a DEM staffer named Brian. They don't use last names, which as a reporter is incredibly difficult to use. I cannot cite someone named Brian in my article, not knowing what actually where the information came from. And that is something that I am running into over and over and over again. Similarly, in October, I reached out to the Department of Emergency Management to try to get more clarity on the budget for the shelter-in-place hotels. I again sent them 3 very specific questions, and they responded with a very long statement that answered none of them. So I reached out to the controller's office. I sent them 2 emails, left 2 voicemails, never heard back. And instead of responding to me, the controller's office forwarded my request to the Department of Homelessness, who then emailed me the exact same statement that I had received from DEM the week prior. And so it's this kind of cyclical situation where I'm not actually able to have a direct line of communication with the departments that I am trying to access information from.
Yeah.
The one useful thing that's happened though is that when you finally do get someone and they try and get in touch with you, they're using their cell phones. So then you start collecting all the damn central commands people's cell phones, and you can try different cell phones. That's been more effective. And I think in the last couple of months, it seems like it's improved somewhat. I haven't tried.
That's good. That's heartening to hear. I mean, everybody under the sun has my cell phone number, so I'm always glad to, I think that's probably the best way to reach people in this era. I want to veer away a little bit from San Francisco for a second and bring in Scott, because Scott, you are a very prolific filer of public records requests. And I want to give you a chance to talk about your experiences with departments outside of the city. You've done tons of work investigating, in particular, utilities and California's utilities regulator over the past year. You've also worked on police misconduct stories. And I personally love following your updates on Twitter, because it really gives a kind of, those of us who don't do this all day, insight into how bizarre the responses to records requests can sometimes be. Like you recently posted about how the Fremont Police Department, I think, told you that they had to hand redact all of their personnel records on paper. We've talked a lot today about getting coronavirus specific information, but you've been reporting on other public offices. Have the responsiveness and the timeliness of the offices that you deal with changed during the pandemic too?
Yes and no. A lot of people are using the pandemic as kind of an excuse to delay or obstruct public records requests. And that's something you run into again and again, is that people, you get back and they say, well, because of COVID-19 and we're all working from home and our staffing is low, and there's so in a couple cases, I've even had them say, we would like you to put off your public records request until the pandemic is over. And you know, transparency in government doesn't just get to end when you know, when there's this kind of crisis. It's even more important that there's transparency.
And also, when is the crisis going to be over?
And that's unclear. And it's, you know, how long do you expect me to put this off for? For a week, for a month, or for, you know, a year, for another 18 months? Who knows? And so, you know, this isn't like a good answer for that question. And frankly, I think that it's an excuse a lot of the times. It's just, there's a lot of, like you said, bizarre responses that you get for public records requests and reasons that they have for delaying this. But at the end of the day, these are things that they can and should be accomplished. California never changed the statutory deadlines for public records requests. They never said that you get a pass because of a pandemic. There's nothing in the orders from Gavin Newsom that's cited repeatedly that says that they can start withholding records. They don't have to turn these things over. There are times that I have found that it makes sense that, say, if I'm asking for something that's buried in a filing cabinet in some state agency and they haven't digitized it, it's years old, it's something that somebody filled out or something like that, and it's difficult to access. That has come up here and there, and that makes sense. But if I'm asking for a trove of emails and you keep pushing it off for months because you say it's the pandemic, that doesn't really make sense to me. You can still access emails from home. You can, you know, all of this stuff is digital. If you're working from home, you should be able to get a hold of this stuff, and agencies just use this as an excuse.
So what ultimately happened with the Fremont Police Department? Did they in fact print out reams and reams of paper and hand redact it and like mail it to you?
Yes, that is exactly what happened. And that was the excuse they were making since SB 1421, the police transparency law, passed and took effect last year. The Fremont Police Department, shortly after that, not only did they want to charge for all the paper that they were using in printing this out, but at the time they said that they had to charge for redacting. So all the staff time it took to hand redact all those documents, you had to pay money to pay for those people to do that. Now this year, the California Supreme Court said they can't do that. Agencies are no longer allowed to charge for redaction time. That is something that they never should have been doing. And finally, there was a ruling against it. So those thousands and thousands of dollars for that are out. But they still said, well, we have these redacted documents. They're only in hard copy format. So if you want them, we're going to have to print them out on, you know, I think it was something like 1,500 sheets of paper. And then they charged me to mail it to me, although they wanted me to come down and pick it up at the department, or they said that they could charge me extra to mail it to me. I opted for the mail. And that's another thing, is that why in the digital age are you having me go down to your office in the middle of a pandemic, and instead of just scanning this stuff and sending it to me via email? And the reason at the end of the day is I don't think there's any other reason except that Fremont doesn't want people to read their police personnel records.
I want to make sure that we also have enough time to get to questions if there are questions. Just a reminder to anybody who has questions, you can submit them to Liana, whose name on the Zoom display is questions/concerns. That's the best way to get them to me. So if you've got something you want to ask our panelists, shoot those at questions/concerns, and they will hopefully make their way into the queue. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to give all of the journalists here a chance to weigh in on just why this matters so much, because for us as journalists, I think it's fairly obvious we want access to information. I know that for me, obviously, a lot of the time my motivation is I want to give, you know, a city department who I'm writing about, or somebody who has a policy that I'm writing about, a chance to weigh in so that they have their say as well. And that sort of is not available if I'm not able to talk to those people. So I wanted to see if any of you have further thoughts about that. Yeah, Nuala.
I think, you know, circling back a little bit to what Scott mentioned, transparency is important in building trust. And so when you look at city departments, especially something like the Department of Homelessness, which has an enormous multi-million-dollar budget, and we don't understand the breakdown of where that budget is going, people start to lose trust in that department. I've seen, you know, huge rise in neighborhood organized groups trying to address issues of homelessness on themselves and by themselves. And I think part of that is born out of a lack of understanding over what the city is doing to manage the problems. And we're seeing the same thing. This week, Heaney called for a hearing on the rollout of COVID vaccines. And the fact that we don't actually have a number of how many people in the city have been vaccinated, or that number has not been made available to us, starts to stir up distrust, right? And so people are really, starting to wonder, is the city doing a good job? Who's getting it prioritized, who's not? And a lot of that response is because the city is not being clear with what its practices are. And so, in order to hold the city accountable, we have to understand what they're doing. And in order to trust the city, we have to understand what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's really outrageous, the lack of information over this time. In testing, for instance, the city can say at all the press conferences, we're testing, we're expanding testing in the impacted communities. But unless, as journalists, we can get that information of where and who they are testing, which they have the data files for all of this, how do we know? I mean, how does anyone know what they're doing? And then when you actually start to get data and piece it together and discover that they're not testing where they should be testing, and you publish it, I mean, that's really important information, and it makes the government better. I mean, it makes the government do a better job. So the lack of transparency in this pandemic, I think, has been a huge problem, and the lack of data has been a huge problem. And now with the vaccinations, the same thing. I mean, they roll out a press conference a couple of weeks ago saying, we're going to talk about the vaccinations. There are about 3 sentences and no real plan. So you do, like, where is the plan? What are you going to do? How many have been? I mean, these are incredibly legitimate questions, which it's odd to me in a way that they haven't thought about this and how this, their presentation, which is haphazard to say the best, makes them look. It is, as you say, Nuala, it doesn't give you great confidence.
Yeah, and going off of those 2 things, I feel like it's always a huge red flag when you have like people on the ground, whether they're family members or homeless people in hotels or people trying to get vaccines, when they're reaching out to you asking how they can get information. We really experienced this in the beginning with Laguna Honda, which, for those of you who might not know, it's the city's largest nursing home facility, maybe one of the largest in the country also, but we were hearing that there was cases there. And, the only reason we were like getting information about testing and PPE shortages was because we had sources that were telling us about it, who were from the inside. And to get information from officials was we had to like pry the information out of them. It was really terrible during the press conferences. I mean, Colfax wasn't even addressing it in the beginning, and I had to hope that he would answer my question when I put it into the chat. But during that, there were so many family members who had their, older mom or dad in that facility and didn't know what the hell was going on. And they were turning to us for answers. It was a similar thing with the homeless hotel program when the city, they said that they were winding it down, but really didn't have a plan to wind it down or a timeline or where people were going. I had homeless people emailing me who could access email asking what is happening with this. So it's not just, it really shows you like the impact that and how important journalism is, because we're the ones who are disseminating the information to the public when the government is falling short.
Got any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody nailed it. And I mean, fundamentally, the last week we've been dealing with like the question of democracy and a challenge of democracy. And I mean, knowing what your government is up to and getting information and transparency from your government is a simple matter of democracy, because you can't engage in democracy unless you know what your government is doing.
Yeah,
it's interesting, it's a government that didn't want to ever acknowledge making mistakes, maybe. And, the city is in the midst of a pandemic. Clearly government officials in San Francisco are trying to do what they can do. And I think they just always want it to appear completely in control and never having made a mistake or a false move. And that's just not the case. And I think, in fact, it would have given people much more confidence to say, well, we did kind of screw up there, but we're trying to do this to remedy that. Like, this is a pandemic. No one has ever gone through this alive has gone through this before. And I think they managed it in odd ways to me, but.
What do you all make of the argument about transparency versus privacy? I think that I hear that a lot when it comes to a question of data and being able to get access to data sets. Is often the answer is, well, we can't give you this because of privacy rules or because of privacy concerns. And I think most of the time reporters are not asking for people's names who are involved in programs. We're not asking for addresses specifically. At most, we might want zip codes. But that's sort of a response that I hear a lot. Are you also getting that? And what do you say? Nuala, I saw you nodding, so I'm going to ask you to answer that one first.
I mean, I think that with this pandemic, we've all had to learn a lot about HIPAA and the rights of patients to preserve their anonymity. I don't think that that should apply to things like city budgets. I personally have not received that about city budgets. I think as residents of the city who are very directly impacted by the city's decisions, that privacy is not warranted for city departments. But on a kind of patient level, yeah, it's been a learning curve to learn how to cover situations without being able to name people specifically without their explicit permission.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, they anonymize all the data. That's just nonsense, that excuse, in terms of data, getting data files on who they're testing and where they're testing. That data is, clean for their personal information right away. So that's not an issue. They have it all. And the thing is, you could see that they were giving bits and pieces of it to different groups. That's how we were getting it. So that wasn't an excuse that made any sense.
Scott, Trisha, either of you, before we go to audience questions, want to weigh in on the privacy question?
Yeah, I feel like in the beginning of the pandemic, it was also, you could argue it was putting people in danger because they had neighborhood level data on where cases were, but they were hiding behind HIPAA and saying, we can't publish this because there's not that many cases. So if we tell you what neighborhood we're gonna be violating people's privacy. And it's like, well, at this point, it's a safety thing, right? Like, don't you want to know, especially in the beginning, when we didn't exactly know how this was being transmitted and how contagious it was, I feel like it would have at least maybe calmed people to have more transparency on where exactly the cases were, and we could see, which neighborhoods were being more impacted quicker.
Yeah, I mean, unless I'm asking for like the names of people and their test results, I don't really see how there's any privacy violations there. If you have, it's obviously they're going to want to collect and track anonymized data, and I don't remember anyone giving me a HIPAA argument with that, but I would object pretty forcefully if somebody tried that.
I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions from people who are attending. The first one is from Bob P, who says, seldom do I hear any reporter interrupt a long digression to say, you're off point, and not addressing the question. Even when asked a simple yes/no question, we often hear blather. Are reporters afraid of not getting notified of future press events? I will say to that just briefly that in the press conferences that the city has had recently, we are not allowed to interrupt. We don't get a chance to do that. But what do the rest of you say to that?
Yeah, that's exactly the issue, right?
Yeah.
Where they can blather, they're behind a screen, so they can blather on as long as they want. Where if we were at a more traditional press conference, at the very least, we'd be able to yell a follow-up question or corner them afterwards. But
Or say simply, you didn't answer the question.
yeah,
right.
Verbally, and someone would back you up. I mean, the reporters at those conferences are asking really good questions. They're just not being answered.
Yeah, and there was one incident where questions had been submitted, and I think they were submitted according to guidelines, according to the rules, and the conference was ended, which later the health department or the Department of Emergency Management sent out a notice apologizing and saying this was due to, I believe, procedural problems. But yeah, I mean, at that point, people were starting to put in the chat, you're not answering our questions. Nuala or Scott, any thoughts on the question of interrupting people because you're worried about not getting further interviews with them?
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, if you listen to my interviews and somebody's blathering on, I'm definitely going to say something about that. But usually my interviews aren't published. So Yeah, I mean, in a press conference, the format usually is they talk for a while and then you get a chance to answer questions. And then that's a lot more of a yelling back and forth and all of that. But, you know, I wouldn't be afraid of interrupting them to not get invited to a future press event, because I think that that's our right to be invited to future press events. So if they try to pull that, I think that that would be illegal, actually.
We have another question from Johnny Funcheap. Has anyone had luck getting more specific ICU data from the state? The COVID data downloads have very limited data points. California is using 4-week projections of ICU capacity to decide when the Bay Area will exit the current stay-at-home order, but the state, to my knowledge, has not shared the exact methodology they're using to make this calculation, or what it considers to be the actual ICU total capacity, so that we can better understand their ICU percentage numbers and make sure that the numbers are accurate. Has anybody been working on state ICU capacity tracking? I don't think any of us have been working on that. I mean that's one of the problems, I think, with with just like these projections, is people ask questions about like, well, how are you deciding that you're going into lockdown, or what do these numbers mean? And we're just not able to get very, very detailed answers. Am I right about that?
It's just like with the hospitalization data. You don't really know how long people are staying in the hospital, you know, what that data represents. And it's been impossible to really get a good explanation of that.
Yeah, so I think, Johnny, the answer to your question is no, none of us have been able to get that. So there's another question from Patricia. Can local and state officials lean on public press to help gather essential information to combat social issues and the pandemic reliefs? I am not sure. I had a couple clarifying questions for Patricia on that. And I am not totally sure if I'm understanding this question correctly, if it means whether or not public officials can also rely on the public press, like the institution, the San Francisco Public Press, to publish information to steer sort of their policies. I mean, I think that our goal is to publish information in the public interest. And so to that extent, yes, of course. Nuala, you've been doing a lot more writing than I have. Do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just always open to suggestions, and there's definitely, you know, a lot that reporters can do just with our skill sets in terms of gathering information. You know, this is the whole point of this. It is harder right now. But yeah, I mean, that's what we do.
Yeah, there's also, I think, a question of whether that's our role. Is our role to inform public officials, or is the role of public officials to inform the public? I don't know. Trisha, what would you say the Chronicle stance is there, if you know?
I don't think you can always trust public officials to inform the public with all the information that either they have, or
Certainly that seems to be the theme of today, right?
Information that isn't like self-serving to them. So I think that is exactly that is the role of the press, right? To hold them accountable to that information, to provide context to the information that they are also providing. But yeah, I mean, obviously we don't work for these public officials, but it is important for us, if they do put out information, well, we need to provide context. We need to call them out if it's inaccurate, dig deeper, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Lydia or Scott, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just echo what Trisha said. I think she nailed it. It's exactly right. I mean, why, you know, I mean, we hope to inform the government through our reporting and wake them up, but we certainly wouldn't take what they say just, well, yes, this is the truth. I mean, we're not stenographers.
Right.
But we, you know, I had an experience where I was looking for statewide data on overdoses, for example, and I asked one legislator who's been working on this if he had that data, and he said, no, we're trying to get it, but if you can get it, let me know and I'll use it. So, you know, I mean, they also rely on us, right, and our powers as press and our ability to, you know, file immediate disclosure requests or public records requests to inform their policymaking as well.
Yeah, I think I was working for ProPublica, and one of their big ideas is that they want to have impact. They want to inform the government, and they want to, you know, take things, not just exposing what government has done necessarily behind closed doors, but I think actually like saying, like laying it out and saying like, look, here's the findings, like, and you know, are you going to do something about this problem? And impact is important there. So informing the government is part of it. And I mean, I'll say that sometimes the government is looking for the press to make connections and make a different part of the government even reveal things that they're unable to. I know that even I've heard like the Oakland City Council can't get data out of its police department, and to some extent they're looking for the police to, or they're looking for reporters to kind of help them with that task and get the police, pressure the police to open up a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, and I think earlier, at the beginning of last year, the public press had a story come out about the CPUC and safety data about Uber and Lyft. And that safety data was not just not available to the public. It turned out that other government agencies had a hard time getting data about Uber and Lyft from the CPUC, which had it, but was not making it available to other parts of government. Jay asks, would anyone like to offer a few words on how responsive and forthcoming the mayor's office and or the supervisors are compared to San Francisco department heads?
Oh, it varies just so widely. I have some supervisors who send me story tips at 11 at night and pick up my phone calls on weekends. And I have others who, you know, I don't even have their cell phone number, or they never pick up. I think there's a huge range. I have personally not had an enormous amount of success getting information out of the mayor's office. But I think it really also varies with department heads as well. Some are very, very amenable to the press, and part of that may be skills in public speaking or just the confidence in what they're saying. And others really have to kind of talk behind the scenes before they can say anything to the media, and that really slows things down.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it also depends again on how self-serving the information is, you know.
Yes.
Yeah. Inevitably.
Fills their agenda, and when, you know, they can kind of beat down someone that they don't like. But yeah, I mean, I've found it, you kind of know the people who you can talk off the record with and who you'll get more information out from that way. And then you kind of have to like piece it together on all the information like that. But yeah, I would agree with Nuala, like it varies so widely on who you can get information from.
Actually, a follow-on to that from Johnny, he asks, which city departments do you feel have done a good job of responding to data or information requests recently? And because we have Scott on the panel here as well, I'm going to expand that to not just city departments, but other departments and agencies. Are there any that have been really responsive, or that you can see they've, put in a big effort to make sure that they actually get you the information that you're looking for?
I would say actually DPH has been very responsive to me, and I don't know if Trisha, you have the same experience covering overdoses and drug use and public health issues. I've always had really speedy responses from them about that, more so perhaps than maybe vaccination information and things like that. But yeah, I think it can depend a little bit on what you're asking.
Yeah, I think the medical examiner's office should really be commended with how forthcoming they have been with information. They have a great person there. He's like a chief, I forget his position, but he's pretty high up in the medical examiner's office. A guy named Dr. Luke Rada, who he really like understands the need to put these overdose numbers out on a regular basis. And now they're reporting these numbers more regularly because there was legislation that was forcing them to. But talking to Dr. Rada, he's like, he's putting it out more than the legislation mandates them to. So he does it every month, where I think the legislation would tell them to do it every like 3 or 4 months or something like that. But because he understands sort of like the public need and the public benefit that we would get from like reporting these numbers with such urgency, I think it's informed our coverage a lot. It's informed, the public's understanding of what's going on with overdoses. And, you could also argue that it's also brought more urgency to the city's response to this as well. Feels weird to praise a city department. But
I'm sure if there are any city department workers in the audience, they're also having feelings about that.
To give credit where credit is due. So.
Yeah. Any commendations from Lydia or Scott?
Not really. I mean, I think I think DPH has gotten very slightly better. I think there are some people who work at DPH who are very helpful and very forthcoming, but I would say the leadership there not so much, which is a shame. And I don't know, maybe it's shifting a bit.
Find that sometimes how responsive and open they are depends on what I'm asking for. And some cities are like, here, you can have this. And then I ask for another thing. And then it's like a whole bunch of obstacles that they'll lay out for me. But in particular, I've had good experiences in the last year with the State Court of Appeals in San Francisco. The clerks over there sent me back documents, I think, same day that I'd asked for. And I'll also say that the Water Board in the Bay Area has a very good public records liaison that was super helpful.
Well, this should be lots of fun. TJ asks, what were some of the most ludicrous or silliest excuses from public agencies that you've been given? I mean, I think maybe one of my favorites has been Scott's example from earlier about having to print out reams of paper and redact them by hand, which I don't envy anybody that job, honestly, of having to like go through and cross out line by line.
Do it. That's the thing is they told me they didn't have software to do it. So then I did a public records request for any invoices when they purchased software that they could use redactions. And you know what? 6 months before they made that excuse, they bought Adobe Acrobat. So they have redaction software. They just chose not to use it and instead print it out and go over it with a Sharpie. So yeah, that's pretty ludicrous.
I've just had a one-line email back saying we cannot answer that question, which was incredibly frustrating. Not ridiculous per se, but just literally cutting off any access to a very important question that I asked.
Yeah, or you find yourself engaging in this sort of cat and mouse game over one piece of information. You know, they'll sort of give you, but not really. And so you explain again exactly what you want for the fourth time, and they'll give you a little bit more. And it's like this back and forth over a week, and it's just kind of nutty. But
yeah, I used to be based out of City Hall with Nuala. Miss seeing you there. But I mean, the benefit of that was that like when you couldn't get information from like a supervisor, you could like run down the hallway and ask them. And I was trying to get information out of a supervisor, and they weren't answering my calls. But then finally they answered my text, and then they answered with something that was like completely, he was like, we're exploring the possibility. And I was like, is that a yes or a no? And he's like, we're exploring the possibility. And I'm like, is that a yes or a no? And he's like, exploring the possibility. And I was like, you're not answering my questions. And then it just went on and on and on like that. And then because he wasn't answering my calls, because he wasn't answering my texts, like I don't know where he lives. I'm sure I could have figured that out. But you know, it's all very frustrating of how they can like, you can like hide behind a screen now as a public official.
Yep. We have a couple of questions here about sort of strategy, I think. One person asks, based on what jurisdiction you're reporting about, do you stick to using the state's Public Records Act, or if it's a San Francisco issue, do you use the Sunshine Ordinance to seek information or answers?
I personally don't really cite the law when I make a public records request. I know a lot of people kind of like go through and you know, reiterate their legal rights when they do it, but I tend to just ask for documents, and then I only argue about the law when I get a bad response. And I know the Public Records Act best. I know that a lot of states or a lot of cities kind of have their own laws in place, and I think that you know, in some cases they dictate a little faster response time or something like that, but I don't think that they usually open things up too much more than the state's Public Records Act does in the first place. So usually I'll just argue about that because that's what I know.
Yeah, someone else also asked what your best strategies are, your best techniques or tactics to pry sensitive but completely public information from the government. I don't know if this question can be answered without revealing trade secrets of any individual reporters, but if you do have any thoughts about that that you want to share, somebody wants to know.
I mean, a lot of it for when you're talking about public records just comes down to really knowing the law, because they'll tell you stuff and it's bullshit and they know it's bullshit. And but it's just like half the stuff you've got to be a lawyer to kind of know. And so, you know, for example, I requested communications with a contractor that they came back and they told me that it was subject to attorney-client privilege. Well, the contractor is not a lawyer. And so why would it be subject to attorney-client privilege? But then you kind of have to know what case law to go back and cite to argue that point. You have to like figure out like, you know, what the legal argument is. And in that case, you either have to be a lawyer or no lawyers, or just kind of have a lot of experience dealing with this stuff. And there's a lot of examples like that. And so the best thing to do is just, if you're doing Public Records Act requests, read the statutes, read case law, and just, you know what your rights are in that case.
Someone also asked if there are any comments about getting information from public agencies such as the PUC or the planning department. I'm not sure if anybody besides Scott has been working on the CPUC on this panel. The San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, I don't know if any of you have been writing about, but if you have been writing about the PUC or the planning department, any thoughts on that? I'm thinking no. I do also want to ask an earlier question, which I hadn't gotten to. Lauren wanted to know what residents can do to advocate for more transparency from government agencies. Is there something that the average person can do to help? Something that you want readers of your writing or listeners to your audio or whatever it is to prod their public officials? Is there a way for the public to do that even?
It's interesting. I mean, you know, talking to your supervisor, emailing the departments that you also want. I mean, there are a couple of people that we're having email exchanges that seem to be constantly doing that. And, you know, doing it in a way that is also not nutty, but just being incessant, you know. And I think that's helpful for them to know that this information and not, you know, just needs to be out. So yeah, in that way, but I don't know, the others, do you guys have?
I've had times when I've written an article that highlighted a lack of information or a lack of response from someone in the city. And when it gets an enormous amount of shares, you know, when people are really sharing it and calling that out, sometimes then I get a call from that person the next day being like, hey, sorry, I missed your deadline. You know? So sometimes people just kind of pointing out the issue and sharing the issue can give it a little bit more weight and kind of pressure people to respond.
Yeah, I mean, my sense of the situation is also that it helps when people are clearly paying attention and when, you know, they're reading the material or they're listening to us and they're also asking their elected officials to make sure that they're responsive to journalists, sort of generally supporting journalism. I'm sure that all of us would be happy to plug, you know, just the various institutions that we work for and supporting them financially. Paying for your news, I think, helps us pay reporters to put in the time that it takes to do this kind of thing, because it does take time and it does take persistence to follow up on records requests and to ask these questions and to just spend the time and working on this. I mean, Lydia, I think you can speak to this, having had multiple reporters out in the field the entire pandemic, right? You've spent an enormous amount of time on getting information.
Lots and lots of time. You know, I have a feeling around the vaccination issue that you're going to see a lot of people calling the mayor's office asking for more information and wanting more information. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on DPH to put out more information about vaccinations. A lot of people are very anxious, you know, rightfully so, about it and when they're going to get it and how they're going to get it. And I think So I think that's going to be interesting to watch, actually, because there's not much information.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're already kind of seeing that based on a story that will be posted on SanFranciscoChronicle.com soon about how, you know, like your local lawmakers, like the Board of Supervisors, are getting so much pressure from their constituents. Like, they're the ones who are getting inundated, and then they're the ones who are like, you're starting to hear them yell about it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you might have seen Supervisor Matt Haney's Twitter rant yesterday about it, and now you have the supervisors are they're calling for a hearing, and then one supervisor called for a resolution calling for more data, and it just, you know, you kind of see this like spiraling effect where hopefully it will eventually lead to DPH and the state health department like creating more transparency, and that's really, you know, that's really a bottom up thing. It starts from having all this frustration, and then it, you know, trickles back up to the people who actually have power to disseminate this information.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention, Lila let me know that one recommendation that we might have for people who are interested in helping get information out to the public is you don't have to be a journalist necessarily to file a public records request. You can do that of your own accord, and I think we've seen stories come out in the press that follow from somebody who's not necessarily a journalist, just filing public records requests for things that they're interested in. You can do that, and then you can try and, you know, share that information however you will, since it is public information, or collaborate with a reporter if you want to get the word out that way. I am curious if any of you have used the Sunshine Ordinance or come before the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force. Somebody did want to know if there are comments about the task force, which this commenter says the mayor has pretty much sidelined for many months. The Sunshine Ordinance is still in effect, but there have been quick response requirements that were suspended because of the health order. And also we have a Sunshine Ordinance Task Force member with us today who says, you know, we'd love to see you there. Have any of you had experience with that and trying to get compliance from the government that way? Okay, looks like no. So I guess we're running out of time, and I do want to make sure that we've gotten to any other questions. If I've missed yours, you can go ahead and put that in the chat to questions, concerns, and I will see it. My apologies if I've overlooked something that you already sent. And I want to give all of our panelists a chance to talk, like, just give your closing thoughts about this time and how the pandemic and the health orders have affected your ability to get the information that you need, and the access to the public officials and the interviews and the information that you think the public needs to know.
I mean, I would say to the reporters out there who are asking questions and how this happens, I think, you know, multiple sourcing and being just tireless. I mean, feel like a junkyard dog on this testing story. Just don't let go. And to people out there supporting local media. I mean, everyone on this panel is working for a place. Subscribe. It's incredibly important. It costs money. It takes professional journalists to do this. So those are two things. And in terms of transparency, it never hurts to email or call your supervisor or the mayor's office and complain about a lack of transparency or a lack. You can watch these press conferences yourself, and people should. And I think it would make you angry.
Yeah, actually, I'll add to that as the rest of you give your final thoughts here. If there's information that you have been seeking or that you think the public should know about and you haven't been able to get it, I think that would be really relevant for people to hear about. Is there something that we don't know because access has been cut off to that information?
Yeah, we still don't know how much the shelter-in-place hotels cost. At this point, I'm going to have to file a sunshine request. Maybe I should reveal that, maybe I shouldn't. But if I keep going on that story, I think that's the only way I'm going to get that information. And that's just going to slow everything down, right? The decisions are being made and people are not being aware of them because transparency is not present. I think the one other thing that I would add is to everyone listening and tuning in, you are also our eyes and ears, and tips really, really matter during this time. I think I can speak for every reporter that we are incredibly overloaded with different things going on right now, nationally and locally. But it's really, really helpful to have people email us and say, hey, even I don't know if this is a story, but I saw this, or I heard this, or I'm experiencing this. That really can inform the direction in which we take our work. And it's invaluable as a reporter to receive tips from the community.
Yeah, I completely echo what everyone else has said, but adding to that, I think this pandemic has really showed the importance of local news because the pandemic is such a local issue, right? And even going back to what I was saying before about getting neighborhood level data, I mean, a big paper like the New York Times or the Washington Post isn't going to be, pushing for the amount of case counts or the testing sites like in the Mission, like Lydia at Mission Local would be doing. So this really shows the importance of supporting your local publications who are actually doing this work, who are questioning the officials that have the most impact on your life as well. So subscribe to all of us.
Scott, any last thoughts from you?
You asked a question about whether or not there's anything that we don't know. And I'll tell you that one thing that I was trying to get my hands on early on in the pandemic was that police departments were supposed to be changing their arrest and booking patterns based on the to try and kind of keep the jail population down. And I had a lot of trouble from a few different agencies getting that arrest data. And one of them, Oakland Police Department, never gave it to me. And that's actually the subject of a lawsuit now. So there are things that just we can't find out about.
Great. Well, we are at the end of our time together. So I just want to thank the entire panel, Nuala, Trisha, Lydia, Scott. Thanks so much for spending this time with us and for talking about this. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. As a reminder, we will be putting out the recording of this event later on. We'll also be using highlights of this discussion in the next episode of Civic, which as always, you can find on the various podcast platforms that you like to listen on, as well as on the San Francisco Public Press website. And with that, we'll let everybody go. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.